In this mini module, I'm going to provide a very general overview of the criminal justice system and of cybercrime. This overview isn't meant to make any of us an expert. It's just simply meant to get us all on the same page and the same foundation to understand what we're talking about when we use the phrase criminal justice system. Indeed, some people will say there isn't really a criminal justice system because what they say is we have different agencies operating in a decentralized manner that aren't really connected or responsible to one another. However, there are many of us that still prefer to call this a criminal justice system, which suggests that it's an established arrangement of parts that are functioning together with the effort of administering and attaining justice. Now, in this sense, I would stress that the system is actually composed of individuals who are given the responsibility and the authority to make decisions about how to proceed with specific cases. And our discussion, our focus will be on decisions that individuals make about how to proceed with cybercrime cases. And as we talk about these, it's important to note these individuals are no different than you and I. They simply have the authority to make decisions that affect the outcomes and the consequences of other individuals who've made decisions themselves. So let's start with the police. With the police, we can talk about that there's actually a decentralized form of policing in the United States. What this means is there's no one specific agency that oversees all of the police. Indeed, we could point out we have local police, state police, and federal police. We have more than 18,000 police departments in the United States. Most of these are at the local level. Some authors will divide the local level into local, county, and urban police, or rural county and urban police. But we will talk about them as local police in general and note that most of the police departments in the U.S. are local police departments, and most of them are in fact in rural or smaller communities. Now that's important because, as I mentioned, there is no one police department that oversees all the police. But when we talk about cybercrime, the vast majority of cybercrime enforcement is done at the federal level by federal police agencies, most notably the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. And I'll come back to that. Now, just as we have different levels of policing, we also have two levels of courts. We have state courts and federal courts. No two court systems have the same structure. Obviously, there's just one federal court system. And that federal court system can be divided into 3 or 4 rings, depending on who you ask. Those who say there's 3 rings in the federal court system will talk about the U.S. District Courts, the U.S. Appellate Courts, and the U.S. Supreme Court. Some people will divide the district courts into the district courts, U.S. District Courts, and U.S. Magistrates Courts. It just depends on how we want to conceptualize this latter. Regardless of how we do it, these courts rings have different functions. The district courts or magistrates courts are the entry point for all cases that come into the justice system. And these cases could be either felonies or misdemeanors. Felonies are criminal cases that someone could actually go to prison for a year or more, whereas misdemeanors are criminal cases for which the punishment would not exceed more than a year in jail, and if even there is even any incarceration. There are many cyber offenses that might be misdemeanors. There are many that might be felons, on the other hand. Now, that's the cases, felonies and misdemeanors enter through the court system, through the magistrate courts or the district courts at the federal level. Now, if folks are not happy with the outcome they do have the right to appeal their case. Now, there are certain rules about whether the appeal will actually be heard. And the federal system has rules of appeal. State systems have rules of appeal. But if an individual does appeal their case, the U.S. appeals courts in the federal system, if it's a federal case, would make a decision about whether or not they're going to hear the case. Now, if they hear the case and they whatever decision they make, the parties could then decide, if they don't agree with the decision, to appeal it to the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court will make a decision about whether or not they'll hear the case on appeal. There's a whole process that's followed, and if you were in a courts class or a criminal justice class, we would go into more detail. But for now, we're simply pointing out that cybercrime cases will enter the courts through the bottom of the court level, the court ladder, and then based upon whether or not appeals happen, may go through the different levels of courts. In the state courts, they're called different things. The actors in the courts are called different things. They might be called prosecutors or district attorneys or solicitors or attorney generals. But for the most part, there's similar sorts of processes in terms of the three or four rings of judicial ladders in the state courts. And then we have corrections. There's different levels of corrections as well. Local corrections tends to include jails and those sorts of local operations. And remember, jails are for defendants that wouldn't be punished for more than a year by incarceration, whereas prisons operate at the state level and the federal level. And these prisons are for the more serious offenders who might be convicted for a year or more. Now, significant here, when I talk about these different agencies, is the fact, if you think about an offender, and the way that an offender's identity, a cyber offender, would change. Prior to being a suspect, they would be just an individual. Crime is committed, then the police investigate and would make a determination about who the suspects are. So that individual goes from being an individual to a suspect. And then, after the police do their investigation, if the case is proceeded and the prosecutor decides to prosecute the case, then that individual goes from a suspect to a defendant. That's an important change in labels. And then that person goes from being a defendant, if they're convicted, to being a convicted offender, a felon, or a misdemeanor, depending on what they're convicted for. Now, this is important to bear in mind as we use our terms, because we don't want to use them interchangeably, because there are significant differences between a suspect and a defendant and a convicted offender. There's differences in terms of how they're labeled, there's differences in terms of the rights they have, and there's differences in terms of how society would respond to them. So having given that sort of an overview, I want to spend a little bit of time just giving a high-level view of what police, courts, and corrections do in general, and then we'll unpack it and talk with a little bit more detail about how each of these agencies work with cyber offenders. Now, generally speaking, when we talk about the police, most experts will talk about three different roles that the police have. The roles include enforcing the law, maintaining the order, and providing community service. Significant here is the fact that these police officers, when we talk about law enforcement and cybercrime, most of that is done at the state and federal level. Very few local police officers get involved in cyber offending. Imagine, for instance, that you were a victim of online auction fraud, and you call your local police. You dial 911 and say, I ordered a treadmill, and they sent me an empty box. Well, the police might show up, but it's not to help you. It might be to arrest you, because they're going to say that we don't respond to those sorts of things. Now, they're not going to arrest you. What they would tell you is that you need to call the Attorney General in the state, or you need to call the federal government. So the local police don't often get involved. Now, while they don't get involved, what we'll see is they need to know about digital evidence. They need to know about digital crimes, because most of our crimes, as we said a few times, have some sort of digital component, and we want the police to be able to help at the local level in those sorts of investigations. But more often, when police at the local level are involved in cybercrime, you might see more service functions being fulfilled than law enforcement functions. When we go to the courts are responsible for adjudicating the law. Police enforce the law, courts adjudicate the law. Now, when we talk about adjudicating the law, we would note that they are simply determining guilt or innocence. Now, it could be a judge or jury making that determination depending upon the case and the decisions that are made in that particular case. And while those decisions would be made, adjudicating the law centers around these ideals of what we call due process. Substantive due process means that the courts, as well as the other agencies in the justice system, need to make sure that they're protecting the rights of the accused. Now, these determinations, though, about whether rights are protected of the accused are made in the courts. On one level, the judges have to make sure that during trials and during the entire criminal justice process, that the defendant's rights are accused. It's key to recognize that these rights come from the Constitution. They are given to everyone. They're given to all of us. These are constitutional rights. The right to plead the fifth, it's called, to not be forced to testify against yourself. The right to not have police come in your house and search for stuff without a warrant. The right not to be subjected to cruel and unusual punishment from the Eighth Amendment. These are the things that the courts have to make sure that these rights are upheld. And then we go to corrections. Corrections are charged, the agencies are charged with applying the law. That's where the punishment happens. So police enforce the law, courts adjudicate the law, and corrections is where the punishment or the consequences are handed out to the convicted offender. They apply the law. They apply the law in order to deter crime, to keep others from committing crime. We talk about with all types of crime, there's specific deterrence and general deterrence, and specific deterrence means we're trying to keep a specific individual from committing future crime, whereas general deterrence, we're trying to keep the rest of us from committing crime. Rehabilitation means we're trying to treat the offender and keep them from doing bad things by addressing the motives that caused the crime. Incapacitation means we're trying to keep this offender away from the rest of us, so we lock them up or watch over them closely. And retribution means we punish people simply because it's a natural emotion, philosophers point out, to want people punished. Now, this is a high-level overview. When we talk about criminal justice system and cybercrime, one of the key aspects that I'll come back to is the fact that cybercrime is a relatively new type of crime. And so the police, the courts, and corrections agencies have evolved in the way they respond to this type of crime. One of the other key aspects to note is that there are many people who suggest that the criminal justice system is just one of many systems. We have a technological system, a social system, an economic system, an educational system. And what they'll point out is that as changes happen in any of these systems, there's implications for all of the other systems. Indeed, the technological system and the educational systems help to develop the computer revolution, help to get us to where we are in the cyber arena. But these changes also produced new strategies for committing crime. And what that meant is the criminal justice system had to respond and evolve in its efforts to respond to cybercrime. So as the technological and social systems and educational systems created new opportunities for crime, the criminal justice system also had to evolve in the same